My name is David Oberhelman. I'm from the Research and Learning Services Division of the OSU Library, and I, along with my now retired colleague from our documents department, Barbara Miller, we are the two that cooked up this idea of having a multi-year look back at the centenary of World War I. And this will be the first program that we'll be doing of the two in the spring. We'll be having another one on November 17th. Dr. Justin Prince, also from the OSU History Department, will be talking about advances in military technology during World War I. So all of you that are interested in artillery, things like that, he'll be having a lot to say about how the war enhanced a lot of the mechanized aspects of the U.S. Army and led to the future. Well, this is a series that's co-sponsored by the OSU Library and the Department of History. And we're looking at the legacy of the Great War back 1914 to 1917. And as we get further into the period when the U.S. entered the war, and next year, 2017, that will be the anniversary of the U.S. entry, we'll be doing some more programming, looking at some of the effects of the war once we got involved with it, especially at some of the effects locally, OSU or OAMC campus, Payne County, as well as internationally. Now today we're very honored to have Dr. Matthew Schauer from the OSU Department of History. He's an assistant professor with a specialty in the British Empire, and he got his doctorate at the University of Pennsylvania. And he is working on right now a project book on ethnography, education, and social engineering in the British colonies in Malaysia. And today he's going to talk with us about a little-known theater of World War I in Africa, and how it impacted the development of the modern political and cultural situation we have today on that continent. So, without further ado, Dr. Schauer.
Thanks to Dr. Oberhelman for asking me to do this. It's been a really great series. I'm happy to be part of it. And thank all of you for showing up. Even those of you that are getting extra credit, I appreciate you coming. So one of the things, when you're studying the First World War in Africa that you have to work against is this conception that it even happened, right? It's not something that's mentioned very often. It's considered to be one of these sideshows of the war. The other being the Middle East. The Middle East has Lawrence of Arabia. It has these sort of big triumphant stories. And the theater in Africa tends to be something that's, for the most part, ignored by historians until relatively recently. Due to the anniversary, you have some historians working on the experiences of Native African troops, reevaluating some of these ideas of heroism in Africa, and things of these nature. So just to begin, due to the centenary of the First World War, the Imperial War Museum in London, which is housed in the former Bedlam Hospital building, had a £40 million renovation of their World War I wing. Has anyone ever been there? Or is a number of you? So they renovated it. It's really impressive. They still have a trench. They unfortunately got rid of the trench smells thing where you could put your nose in. If anyone wants to experience what that was like, just go to the Colvin Center. It sort of smells like that, like old sweat. But one thing that they did do was they basically rebuilt the entire section dealing with the Western Front, the British experience of war, and they spent, as I said, a lot of money doing this. This is the only artifact dealing with Africa in the First World War that was in the exhibit. I went there this summer, I looked far and wide, and this is the only thing that was there. So what is this? What do you guys think this is? There you go. So it's an Askari hat, right? So a hat worn by an Askari, which is a native African troop. It's a fez. So it might look familiar to you. The Shriners obviously wear them. That's where we see them most often. The fez is sort of a typical military hat. It's used by the Algerian troops in North Africa. It's adopted by the Zouave regiments during the Civil War, the American Civil War. And it's something that tends to be sort of the typical hat worn by black African troops in the 19th and early 20th century. And so this particular hat is from the SS Troopa from Cameroon, the German colony of Cameroon from 1914. And so the hat you saw there was red. Red obviously makes a good target. And so when these guys are in the field, they cover this up with a khaki cover to make themselves sort of less ostentatious. And so this gentleman here is a member of the SS Troopa. The SS Troopa are the sort of colonial defense forces of the German colonies in Africa, and they're the people we're going to be talking about today in terms of these events of the First World War. The SS Troopa themselves also are the colonial military force responsible for putting down rebellions in the late 19th century in these colonies in Africa, enforcing taxation, various other laws, these sorts of things. So keep that in mind. This is sort of the German side of things, and this is the only object put into memory in the entire Imperial War Museum. Oops. So when we talk about the First World War in Africa, more than history, you tend to think of popular culture with this. Famously, you have the African Queen from 1951 starring Humphrey Bogart and Katharine Hepburn, depicting the First World War in Africa, kind of an amalgamation of a couple of different events that we're going to talk about today. But typically, these are very much focused on, white people in the midst of this sort of fight, in the midst of the war, in the midst of this sort of great adventure. And it leaves out a lot of these native troops who are the vast majority of the combatants during the war. So just so you can get a sense of this, the Askaris, both German, Belgian, French, and British, there are 38,000 of them fighting in the war. And this does not include native porters, of which there are around 1.5 to up to 2 million of them. People that are carrying munitions, supplies, all of these sorts of things. So keep that in mind. The white people are very few in number in most cases. They tend to be in sort of leadership roles, and the vast majority of the combatants are actually people from Africa. And so this theater gets sort of played up as being this kind of exotic, place of adventure. They're tapping into a lot of these sort of trends of exploration, these sorts of things. But still, the First World War in Africa exemplifies a lot of these major trends in the First World War as a whole, such as the pointlessness of it. You see a lot of just ridiculous absurdity that happens in terms of ineptitude and command, the pointlessness of just sort of all of this fighting to basically get nothing, or to get nothing that has any really strategic importance. You get extreme brutality happening in Africa, similar to what you get on the Western Front. So the fighting is different, but you get extreme amounts of loss of life. Hundreds of thousands of people die in the East African theater during the war, and it's something that is, as I said, rarely mentioned in sort of popular histories. So keeping with this trend of popular culture, you get movies like Shout at the Devil, starring drunken Lee Marvin, in the film anyways. So your middling James Bond, Roger Moore, playing a British imperialist. And this is a depiction of the Königsberg battle, which I'll talk about in a second. The same sort of themes, exotic Africa, elephants, crocodiles, fighting in the jungle, these sorts of things. As you move farther into the 20th century, you get the First World War in Africa being talked about in terms of satire. They're exploring all this sort of ridiculousness and things that happen. And one of the books that exemplifies this is this book, An Ice Cream War, by the British novelist William Boyd. So I don't know if anyone's read it, but basically it deals with a German man and an English man who are neighbors. And like many neighbors, they secretly hate each other but pretend to like each other. And they are basically facing off, and they're very cordial. And then the war starts. The German neighbor steps over and takes over this guy's sisal plantation, so his rope-making operation, and the British guy basically vows revenge. And so it follows him through the entire East Africa campaign as he tries to sort of take revenge on the Germans. And it's very darkly comic, but explores a lot of these ideas of absurdity that happens during the war. So for instance, there's a British general who never ducks when the fighting is happening, and whoever stands next to him always gets killed no matter what's happening, so everyone tries to avoid him. But this is a sort of trend in popular culture when we talk about this theater of war, and this is a more recent one from 2004 that deals with the Battle of Lake Tanganyika, which, like I said, is another one of these sort of ridiculous events that occurs in this campaign. Okay, so how do we get to this point? How do we get to fighting in East Africa? The First World War is very much an imperial war, but this all really goes back to the Scramble for Africa, exemplified by the Berlin Conference. So here we have a cartoon from the time of Bismarck dividing Africa up like a cake and passing them out to the various ministers from the various European nations. The United States is also there, as they decide sort of what to do with Africa. And so the goal of the Berlin Conference is to decide the Belgian Congo question, whether France, Britain, Germany, or whoever will get in charge of the Congo. The Belgians ultimately win out as sort of a neutral party. And the goal of all this is to keep fighting from happening, right? So you have all this competition, fighting over borders and things like this in Africa. And so if they decide that you can prove as a nation that you have treaty rights over a place, then you have rights to it. There's not going to be all this giant war, all this infighting that would happen in Africa. Everyone will make their money. Everything will stay sort of peaceful and at equilibrium. So after the scramble for Africa, this is how things sort of shake out in terms of the map. Okay, so you have your German colonies here, Southwest Africa, German East Africa, which we're going to talk about today. So modern-day Tanzania, modern-day Kenya. This is sort of the theater we're going to spend the most time on. They also have a colony in Togoland, and they also have a colony that takes up a portion of modern-day Cameroon. Sorry, right here. And so as you can see, everything that's red is owned by the British. Everything that's a lighter tan color is owned by the French. These are the big sort of colonial powers. And so when we get to the First World War, you get all the tension that's been boiling up from 1884 onwards, in which the Germans want to take over these British and French colonies. The British and French want them out. They want to protect their own. And so things are basically at a standstill in terms of inter-country fighting for a couple years until we get to 1914 when everything boils over. This being said, there's still a large amount of violence occurring in these German African colonies. So, for example, there are 3 major rebellions that occur, 2 in German East Africa and 1 in German Southwest Africa. So in 1891, there's a rebellion called the Hehe Rebellion that's really brutal and really stamped out heavily by the German SS Troopa, so by the African soldiers. Then another high-profile one is the Maji Maji Rebellion, which happens from 1905 to 1907. In this, you have nearly 100,000 Africans killed. And so this rebellion arises because you get a millenarian leader who says that he is an embodiment of a snake god. He goes to various tribes and he gets them all to join together, and he tells them that if they put blessed water on themselves, that they will be able to repel German bullets. This is obviously not true. The leader of the rebellion is hanged in 1905, but the rebellion goes on for many years, and due to the large casualties, you can see that the Germans really stamp it out extremely brutally. By this time, we get to the Herrera Wars in 1904 that extend all the way into 1908. And so in the Herrera Rebellion, you have the Herero and Nama people of modern-day Namibia rising up because their land has been taken by the Germans who want to mine for various things, turn it into plantations. Hermann Goering's father is one of the governors of these regions. And so they rise up, they have this revolt, and once again, the Germans stamp it out extremely brutally. These are members of the SS Troopa, these are officers. They also use colonial police. And it's exemplified in a number of really sort of horrific circumstances in battles. So it's a little difficult to see, but this is a contemporary card produced at the time in which you have Hereros raiding a German village, in which they have burning down the buildings. They have tied this man up and they're torturing him, and they're running off with all of his livestock. So you have a really strong, racialized sense of fighting and things like this that's building up, but also you have the SS Troopa who are already very much ingrained into this culture of colonial power with the Germans. They are well trained, they are used to doing these sorts of things, they are a well trained, put together fighting force, and they are going after fellow Africans. And so I mentioned this is a particularly brutal war. It's a little difficult to see here, but one of the solutions the Germans come up with to the Herrera Rebellion is to put them in concentration camps. So this is not the first mass concentration camp, mass use of concentration camps in Africa. Does anyone know what the first one was? Boer War, absolutely right. So the Boers are put into concentration camps by the British in the late 19th century. They put the Herero people in work concentration camps in which thousands and thousands of them die of disease. And when they die, they actually mummify, and in some cases strip their heads of skin, and they send them to museums worldwide. And so that's what these guys are doing in this photo. They're boxing up Herero skulls and sending them onward. So extremely, extremely brutal. Those that are not put into concentration camps, they stick out and they try to continue this rebellion until there's this battle of Waterberg in August of 1904, in which this is sort of the final pitch battle. The Germans make a line of machine guns, they push them all into the desert, and they give them the option of either running into gunfire or running across the desert to try to survive. This is literally mass genocide. Their goal is to kill all of them, and these are people that make it across the desert. And tens of thousands of people die, and they find some of them 30 feet deep where they've been trying to dig for water. So extremely, extremely brutal, horrific acts, and sanctioned by the German government. The government actually issues an order in October 1904 saying that any Herero man, woman, or child that's seen should be immediately killed. So this is a sort of milieu of really intense violence, that's in existence in this stage as we lead into the First World War. On top of this, you have this larger context of imperial competition that happens. And this is sort of what we're stepping into at the start of the First World War. So in the First World War, you have basically a couple of different aims. The Germans particularly want to solidify their control over this middle sort of sub-Saharan region of Africa. So they signed off on the Berlin Conference, they signed off on giving the Congo to the Belgians, but they decide that they want to have middle Africa and make it all a big sort of German state. And so this is what pushes their aggressive actions in the sort of early summer of 1914. And so the British just want to eliminate the Germans, right? They want them out of Africa. They want to expand. They would like to have control over Tanzania and some of these other areas as well. And so as a result, the initial fighting happens with a coalition force of Belgian, French, and British soldiers in Togo. It also happens in Cameroon that way. The Belgians and the British work together and fight in German East Africa. And the British and the South Africans are responsible for most of the fighting in German Southwest Africa. So most of the fighting that happens in this war happens relatively quickly. So Togoland capitulates in August 1914. Cameroon, the fighting is over by March 1916. And Southwest Africa is conquered by July 1915. Which leads us to the fighting in East Africa itself. And so you can get a sense of this from far away. There are lots of troop movements. There's lots of fighting. Anytime you see one of these marks is a battle. You have naval battles going on. You have constant guerrilla warfare occurring around the Uganda Railway, which we'll talk about here in a second. But just get a sense of this. There's lots of troops coming in and out of East Africa. There's a lot of fighting going on, and the fighting extends all the way through till 2 weeks after the war officially ends. So the first major battle, if we're talking about East Africa, is the Battle of Tonga, which happens from November 3rd to 5th, 1914. So just to give you some context to this, the British set up their expeditionary force. They divide them into two parts. They send one group towards Kilimanjaro, one group towards Tonga. The leader of the British expeditionary force is a man named General Aiken, and Aiken has spent 30 years in British India. So instead of using African troops like the Germans are using, he decides that he wants to bring troops over from India because he sees them as being martial races. He sees them as being distinct warriors. They're not disorganized and primitive and things like Africans. They follow orders. They're meant to be soldiers, unlike Africans. And so he gets all these guys, he puts them in ships, he takes them over from India. It takes 2.5 weeks, most of which is spent being seasick. There's disease on the ships. People show up and they're in a really horrible state. So you can see one Indian soldier there, if you can see his turban on his head. And so little does he know, but the Germans are already waiting for him. So there's a General Paul Emil von Lettowvorbeck, which we'll talk about extensively. He's the leader of the German troops. And he's sitting there in this town of Tonga, which he's cleared out, just sitting there watching, waiting for the British to arrive. And so the British decide to land. They very slowly get their expeditionary force ready on the beach over the course of a couple days. And the German generals are literally bicycling around with their binoculars, drawing troop movements and just getting everything completely set to annihilate them. The Germans are actually outmanned by 8-1, but they completely dominate and completely destroy the British regiments at this battle. So the battle begins. The Indian troops, who have been very, very ill-equipped and ill-trained, they're also sick. They show up. As they're washing up the beach, someone accidentally shoots their gun, and a number of the Indian troops actually run into the ocean because they're afraid. So this doesn't start off well for the British. They move into these jungle areas, and the German machine guns start going off, and half the Indian regiment runs away. The reserve troops then move up, and then they run away as well. As the Germans come into the troops that stay in line, they get attacked by bees. So this is one of these things that happens a number of different times in the African theater. They have to deal with the terrain, right? Not just the heat and the disease, but also the animals. So there are logs that the inhabitants of the village have put up to collect honey, and there are killer bees inside of them. They rush and they sting both of the troops. One British man is found with 300 bee stings on his head. So on top of this, they're completely getting annihilated. The British general who planned this is back at his ship watching all this stuff happening in disbelief, and he has his ship shell the city, and one of the shells goes into the hospital and kills all the people in the hospital. So not going very well for the British initially, even though they have started out with a huge numerical advantage. So one of the men who is with these troops is this guy, Richard Minor Taagan. So he's one of the guys that's leading the Indian regiments. And as soon as the guys start to flee, he starts shooting his own troops. So this is a start for him. He's someone you might have heard of before. He comes up with this idea of Maynard Taagan's haversack, which is this plan that he comes up with later in the war where you take a haversack and put documents in it and leave it someplace, and then the enemy finds it and sort of thinks they found secret plans. So he's a very sort of interesting kind of problematic figure. He becomes a famous ornithologist after the war, but he's also known as being sort of a pathological liar. So he becomes involved in all these commando troops and things, and he'll show up again in a second. One of the things he's most famous for outside of this is he always had this anecdote that he had had dinner with Adolf Hitler with a loaded gun in his pocket, and for some reason he decided not to shoot him. That was his big story. And a recent book has come out accusing him of being a fraud and killing his wife and all these sorts of other things. But basically at this point, he's a young army officer. He sees this happening. He goes back to the ship and says, you know, we need to surrender. This isn't working. So Aiken sends him to surrender to the Germans. He comes in under the white flag. The Germans take him in and essentially say, oh, we feel really sorry for you. Have breakfast. And they hang out and they drink and things. And they send him back. And as he's walking back with the white flag, one of his own sentries tries to shoot him. And Maynard Taagan takes the sentry's gun and kills him with his own bayonet. So really extreme brutality from the get-go in the start of the war. And so just to give you a sense of levels of loss that happens, the British lose 817, they have 817 casualties, and they lose 20 officers and 340 soldiers, and the rest are native troops, so British soldiers. The Germans only lose 148 people in terms of casualties, and they only lose around 50 people killed. But the biggest loss for the British at this battle is that for some reason, when they leave and surrender, Aiken makes them leave all of their weapons. So even though the Germans didn't have very many men, they also had very poor weapons and materiel. So they had guns from 1871, but thanks to the British, they leave all their weapons, all their ammo on the beach. Now they're completely equipped. Everything is looking good for the Germans and this gentleman. So the leader of the Schutz Troopa, as I mentioned, is this guy, Paul von Lettowvorbeck. So he's a very interesting character in his own right, and he's one that's sort of held up as being kind of this hero of the early part of the war. So he has a background in that he is a career military soldier. He went to a military academy. His father is a famous general, and he spent time fighting the Boxer Rebellion. He spent time fighting in the Herrera War. Later, German texts make a big point of saying, oh, he wasn't involved in the genocidal part of it to try to sort of maintain his heroic reputation. And he's someone who's put in charge of this expeditionary or this defensive force in German East Africa in early 1914. And so he's through and through a soldier. People describe him as being someone of a different time, very sort of gentlemanly and this kind of career soldier figure. And so when he gets to this region, the German government tells him that we're not going to fight. So before all this fighting happens, the general stance of the governor in German East Africa is, we're friendly with these people. We have a handshake agreement. We're not going to fight. We're just not going to do this, so don't even think about it. So he responds by taking all of his troops and basically setting up and fighting. And so the governor gets these telegrams every once in a while saying, like, we're fighting in this region, and the governor responds with these long, telegrams saying, what are you doing? You can't do this. And then he'll respond with, like, we took the city, that sort of thing. So he kind of takes it upon himself to run the entire East Africa campaign. And so why he's so legendary and famous is that he does not lose a battle the entire war, and he makes it all the way to the end until he has to sign the armistice 2 weeks after the official armistice on the Western Front. So part of this legend surrounding him is that this idea that he is a good German, right? He's almost like Erwin Rommel in the Second World War. He's this great tactician. He's not evil. He's someone that loves his African troops. He views them as equals. They love him back, this sort of heroic sort of ideal that comes through. And so there's some truth to this in the sense that these Askaris, many of them have known him for a while. They do stay with him. But historians such as Michelle Moyd from the University of Indiana have explored this idea that many of these troops don't leave him because where else are they going to go? They're ingrained in this system. They've surrendered their identity. They've surrendered their tribal connections. This is what they do for a job. This is their leader. They're going to stick with him forever. In terms of going after this myth, part of the reason that so many people die in the East Africa campaign, hundreds of thousands, is because These guys use a scorched earth policy as they go from village to village, and they forage really aggressively, to say the least. So they take everyone's cattle, they take everyone's food, and there's a massive famine that happens in 1916, and hundreds of thousands of people starve to death in East Africa as a result of von Lettow's troops sort of moving around and taking these various villages using guerrilla warfare. And so he's referred to as the ghost general because of the fact that they can never find him. And his whole goal in fighting this battle is to waste the British Army's time and men. And so this is sort of a theme you'll see as we go through these various battles. But basically, they want to waste time. They want to keep these guys away from the Western Front. And so he just leads them basically on a wild goose chase all around East Africa for the entirety of the war. He has small sort of guerrilla military actions. He disappears. They'll be fighting one day. 2 hours later, there'll be no one there. And he just sort of keeps them running around the entire war trying to chase him. And so as a result, they refer to him as the Ghost General. One of the very specific targets that they're focusing on is this Uganda Railway. So the Uganda Railway itself is something that the British built in 1896. It has a nickname, the Lunatic Express. It's the building of it, around 3,000 people die. There's horrible instances of disease, horrible accidents, and also man-eating tigers. So the building of this is just sort of rife with problems, and this is the main sort of connecting point between Lake Victoria and the coast. It's a main port of sort of supply route for the British. And so von Lettow and his troops attack it 57 times in 18 months. They blow up tracks, they put mines on it, they blow up various trains themselves, and it becomes their big sort of focal point, and it's very, very difficult for the British to catch them. This is an image of one of the lions, that was finally killed after this line and another one killed 135 people while they were building the railway in 1894. So there's a movie with Val Kilmer about it. Okay, so how do they get them from blowing up the tracks? They build an armored troop carrier. They said there's no way they're going to blow them up. This is going to work out great. We spent all this money and time on this. This is what happens to it. Does it work out? They bomb it. They blow up the bridge to Zavo a number of different times where the lions were. And it's something that they basically are a thorn in the side of the British for the almost entirety of the war. And this is something that pushes von Lettow's legend. So this is actually a poster trying to get people to basically give money to a war fund, sort of buy bonds in support of von Lettow in Africa. Okay, so von Lettow has a number of other different battles. There's one large battle that's a siege in 1916 and one other pitched battle, but the majority of these are very sort of short exercises, short guerrilla warfare, and his tactics are used in textbooks about guerrilla warfare today to sort of deal with this. So while this is all going on in the land, you have a number of different high-profile and ridiculous naval battles. So the most famous of these is the Battle of Rufiji Delta, which lasts from October 1914 all the way to July 11th, 1915. And so what this is a search for this ship, the Königsberg. So the Königsberg is sort of the sort of jewel in the crown of the German Navy in the region. It's a massive cruiser, and it's sort of wreaking havoc on shipping and material along the coast. It sinks a British ship called the HMS Pegasus, and after it does that in September of 1914, it heads into the Rufiji Delta to hide. It needs to repair itself. The Delta has all these sort of long estuaries that they can hide in, and it's this massive ship, but the British can't find it. So they look for it, and finally on July 11th, they find it, and they put it in this condition. And so this is a very slow process that exemplifies a lot of the fighting in the war. So they can't find it. The first thing they do is they go to Jan Smuts, who's the South African general who later becomes Prime Minister of South Africa. And he says, I have a friend who's an elephant hunter that is going to help you find the ship. So they find this guy, they get him out of jail in German East Africa, where he is in jail for killing 47 natives in self-defense. And they take him out, and he's this very sort of, grizzled old hunter, and they send him out to try to find the ship. They also find a guy that has a rudimentary airplane that has silk wings. They put him up trying to look for the ship. He crashes, and he gets captured by the Germans. And finally, they get planes to come in from England to look for this, and they eventually find it and sink it. And it sat there until 1960. You can sort of see it here. The light's a little bright, and the way they sink it is they bring ships in using tugboats from Greece. They bring in monitor ships that are very similar to the ones used in the American Civil War. And in the first day, they shoot 635 shells at it in an attempt to sink it. Only 4 shells hit. So they go after and they shoot at it for nearly 20 hours until they finally hit it enough to cripple it. And so they cripple it, they win the battle, they're celebrating. In the meantime, the Germans take all the guns off of it, all the ammunition. Their captain is wounded. He goes to a military hospital and escapes. Basically, everyone bails from the ship except those that have been killed and lives on to fight another day. And they take the gun from the ships and they put it on another ship called the Graf von Gürtzen, which we're going to talk about here in a second. So the other major naval battle is the Battle of Lake Tanganyika. And if you think of von Lettow as being a military genius, this British man, Geoffrey Spicer Simpson, is the complete opposite of that. So the Germans have ships in Lake Tanganyika that are controlling shipping. They're going after the Belgians. They want to take them out. And so they ask someone in the Admiralty to be in charge of this expedition. He says, I'm not going to go there. And Spicer Simpson is sitting at the desk next to him, and he volunteers to go. And so they say, well, why not? We'll let you do this. This is a massive mistake. Spicer Simpson is at a desk for a reason. So he once had his own ship. He hit another ship with it and sunk it and got his command taken away. They put him at a desk. They gave him another ship. He was on a survey vessel in the Gambia for 4 years. It went okay. He didn't sink anything. Then the war breaks out, and they give him another command, and they put him in charge of a gunboat. The gunboat is torpedoed in broad daylight while Spicer Simpson is at a bar trying to hit on women. And so this does not go well. He ends up back at a desk, and that's where he's sitting when they give him command to go after these ships in Lake Tanganyika. And so he's a very, very eccentric person, to say the least. There's a number of different stories about him. I'll show you some examples in a second. One of these that comes through is he wants to have a chimp with him at all times. So here's his chimp getting a haircut. He demands that the chimp come with him at all times. When they're putting the expedition together, his underling tells him that they're not going to have medical supplies. He says, don't worry about it, let's just have a drink. So they don't have anti-malarials. They don't have a number of different medical supplies when they go on to this. He gets in a fight with the captain on the way to Africa because he gets yelled at for smoking by the gasoline, a number of different things. And so he very much exemplifies the absurdity of this sort of theater of war. I mentioned Camouflage Zebras. This is an image from the Imperial War Museum from East Africa in which they are trying to camouflage their cavalry horses by painting them with zebra stripes. No one really knows what the context of this is, but there's a couple of images of this, and so there's no way to know whether it was effective. Okay, but back to the Battle of Lake Tanganyika. So their plan is that they're going to bring monitor gunboats, just like they did previously, and take out these ships in Lake Tanganyika. This time they build them in England, and they bring them by ship, by tractor, by train, and by native bearer to Lake Tanganyika. Here are these guys pulling this thing on wheels to put into the lake. And Spicer Simpson puts it upon himself to name these boats, and he wants to name them Dog and Cat. And the Admiralty says that's stupid, so he names them Mimi and Tutu, which apparently is fine. And here he is on the prow of Mimi, or actually Tutu, excuse me. Okay, so what they do is they seek out this ship, and the first one they come across is a ship named the Kanagi. And so he has no idea what he's doing. He's on this gunboat. One of his famous eccentricities is that he wears a battle skirt. So this is him right after the battle, actually. So not a kilt. He emphasizes not a kilt, a cotton skirt so that the air can flow freely. His wife makes them for them, and he's very big on saying that this is the ultimate battle dress. So one of his other sort of eccentricities. So he's leading this military expedition. They see the boat. He has no idea how to steer a ship, and so they smash right into it. He flies off the top. He lands in the middle of the deck, which is burning from being hit with shells, and he jumps up and says, I've taken the ship. He finds the captain who is dead, takes his wedding ring off and puts it on himself and declares himself a victor. And so they take out this ship essentially by accident, and he goes back and he celebrates on the shore with a bath. So one of the other things about him is that he is completely tattooed from his torso upwards because he likes to show it off and thinks it makes him fearsome looking. And so he has a bathtub brought out and he takes a bath and drinks vermouth in front of all the soldiers to celebrate this. So it takes a while for the British Admiralty to realize that he's a buffoon. And when they realize it is because they send him after this ship, the Graf von Gürtzen. This is the ship that gets the guns from the Königsberg, and it's wreaking havoc on shipping. So as you can see, he didn't do a great job of finding it because this is it today, right? It still exists. It works as a ferry in Lake Tanganyika. They send him after it. He keeps delaying it. He doesn't feel like doing it. And the ship lasts until the end of the war. And the Germans eventually decommission it. And someone actually takes it up from the bottom of the lake, reconditions it, and uses it still today. So this is another one of these sort of ridiculous stories of the theater of war. And so The rest of the time in East Africa, the majority of the fighting is spent chasing von Lettowvorbeck, and all of these lines are them chasing him around East Africa in various forms. And it goes all the way until, I said, November 23rd, when he signs the armistice. So this armistice memorial is in, former North Rhodesia. Let me look what the new name is. Excuse me, in Mbala. So Mbala, Zambia today, commemorating the end of the war in Africa. So he is about to start fighting again. He gets a telegram saying the war is over, but he still hangs out until they essentially force him. And he shows up with 2,000 Askaris, signs the British demands, and this is the end of the war in East Africa finally. And so when we think about this, there's all these sort of battles and things that you saw, but there's an extreme amount of loss of life that happens in this campaign that goes almost the entirety of the war. So in terms of British casualties, you have 11,189 killed in action. They conscript over 1 million porters to carry things, and at minimum, 110,000 of them die. They don't really keep records very, very well for these sorts of things. The King's Africa Rifles are the main sort of British Askari regiment, and we'll talk about them more in a second. And nearly 4,500 of them die in battle, and 3,000 of them die of disease. So these whole campaign, the whole thing that they're doing, they're not just fighting with violence, they're fighting the terrain, as I mentioned before. So they're fighting over water holes. One of the tactics the British use is that they put poisoned birds around a water hole to make the Germans think that it's a poisoned well. Both the Germans and the British use young children to test the water to see if it's poison, which is pretty horrifying. There's instances of British and German troops getting attacked by animals who want the water. In the first 18 months of the war, 30 British soldiers are killed by wild animals. There's an instance where rhinoceroses charge both sides and fight them as they're trying to fight for water. On top of this, you have the tsetse fly, you have malaria, you have typhoid, you have smallpox, all these things wreaking havoc on both sides. And so 177 British soldiers from Britain are killed. And just to give you a sense of this, if we look at just British East Africa alone, 45,000 people, or 1/8 of the population, die in this 4-year period. So on the German side, you have 2,000 troops that are killed in action out of around 14,000 Askari. But just in the East African campaign alone, around 365,000 people die from violence, starvation, or disease. This is before the Spanish flu epidemic hits, and then you get 160,000 people dying in British East Africa alone in 1 year in 1918, and around 2 million dying in sub-Saharan Africa over the course of 1918. So extremely, extremely brutal, which ultimately doesn't lead to much in terms of change of the landscape, as I'll talk about here. Okay, so back to the Askari. We've talked about the leadership aspect of this, but why do these people sign up for this? Why do these people do this? The number one reason is they don't have a choice, right? They're conscripted, sometimes forcibly. For instance, the French soldiers in Senegal, many of the Senegalese actually tried to run into the bush to hide, to not be conscripted, and they actually have forces that basically go in and enslave them and force them to join the military. This is an image from Togo, as you can see. And this guy's basically making the case that signing up for the SS Troopa is something that would be beneficial to them. And in many ways it is. So why these guys are joining the SS Troopa from the 1890s onwards is that it's a reasonable wage. The German Askari get paid twice what the British Askari do. If you're in the SS Troopa, you're allowed to bring your wives and children, and they basically follow as kind of camp carriers and things like this. And there's a lot of also benefits in terms of potential social mobility and these sorts of things. So it might help you to raise your status in society, to get in good with the colonial powers. It gives you a regular wage, regular food, and there are certain advantages to doing this. So this is why you have these guys joining initially, but then as I said, as the war progresses, you get increased quotas. So in Senegal, the French government says, we need 60,000 Askari to send to the Western Front. And they say that's impossible without enslaving people through forced conscription, and they say, well, that's what we're gonna have to do. So around 1/3 of them get taken forcibly and sent to the Western Front. I'll show you an image of them in a second. But these are the sort of two sides of things. If you're not fortunate enough to be a soldier, you're most likely going to be conscripted unpaid as a porter. So there are some exceptions to this. Meinhard Taagan, who I mentioned before, he sets up a regiment called the Skin Troops, where he basically says, you are a member of the British Army if you show up with a dead German's uniform or rifle, and he sends them out to basically set up their own kind of mercenary corps. But most people are actually put into these carrier corps, both officially and unofficially. The Germans are much worse at keeping track of it. They have around 350,000 porters during the war, and conservatively 1 in 7 of them are killed. And so when there's not enough food, there's not enough water, the porters and the carriers are the ones that don't get it, and they're perceived as being replaceable. And so on the British side of things, the Askari group in East Africa is called the King's African Rifles. Here's an example of them being taught how to use the Vickers machine gun. And here's them in their full battle dress. And so, as I mentioned before, the British are less big on this. They don't deem African troops as being successful soldiers. They prefer to use Indian troops, so they perceive as being a martial race, being militaristic in nature, being disciplined. And so, at the start of the war, there are not very many members of this group. Let's see. By 1914, there were only 2,300 Askari, and they actually have been whittling it down up to that point. But by the end of the war, there are 24,000 of them, and they form the bulk of the fighting force in East Africa. And so, as I said, they're paid half as much as their German counterparts. They're typically not given a lot of training, and they're the ones that are fighting on the British side for the majority of this. And the King's African Rifles stays as a regiment all the way through the start of the Second World War, when they become the Kenyan Rifles. And I'll show you an image of them here in a second. But these are the people who are basically fighting this colonial war that's completely bent on literally oppressing them. So you also have troops going to the Western Front. So these guys from Senegal, the 60,000 of them, are sent to the Western Front. So there's even an image in, there's a passage in All Quiet on the Western Front where the narrator describes seeing black French troops charging at them. And so this guy has his traditional weapon, the coupe or the coupe, basically a long knife, and what they use them for is as shock troops. So the French military are the only people to bring black Africans to the Western Front, and they say they are fundamentally savage. They're the best people to send in on a charge to take the brunt of the machine guns. They can't be trained to defend anything or follow orders. And so these guys get sent from Senegal. Many of them are suffering from disease by the time they get there. They have to go through the winter. They suffer from the weather quite a bit. And many of them don't make it. By the time they get to the front, they're used as shock troops, and they have a very sort of extremely difficult war and are not given any credit for their bravery and a variety of different sort of very successful actions that they do. They're basically lumped together as kind of uncivilized African troops. There's an image of them in the trenches during the war, sort of miserable, as you can imagine. Okay, so what does this do for these African troops? Obviously, you know, they're very much being exploited. They're being forced to do this. Are there any benefits of this? Why would someone do this, right, if they had any choice about it? Some of these guys don't, but some of them actually do. You have people like Marcus Garvey in Jamaica actually saying they should support the war effort. You have W.E.B. Du Bois in the United States pushing with the NAACP for them to include black troops to send over with the United States. So the Harlem Hellfighters are the first sort of big combat regiment that comes over that's conscripted or arranged in Harlem. So you have American troops sending black soldiers, but the vast majority of them don't see action at all. So 80% of black American troops that are sent over actually don't touch a weapon in the theater of war. They're used as cooks and bearers and these sorts of things. But in terms of European powers, the French are the only ones that send them to the Western Front. And so why the other powers don't do this? Basically, it's racism, and to the extent that they say they're not going to be able to be controlled. If we send them over to Europe, they're going to get too big of a head, and they're going to think that they're equal to white soldiers. They're going to get exposed to things that are going to change their minds about colonial power. And one of the big things that comes up is this sort of sexual idea as well. They're afraid that if you let African troops loose in Europe, that there are going to be half-caste children running around everywhere. In terms of some of these Senegalese soldiers' diaries, a historian named Dick Van Galen has studied them, and this is happening. They're going to brothels, they're meeting women, and they're also becoming much more cosmopolitan. They're experiencing Paris, they're experiencing France and Belgium, and they're bringing these things back with them to Senegal. They're also bringing back these ideas that are floating around the world in terms of PanAfricanism, the ideas that ultimately form the negritude movement, things like this that are awakening in many of them a sense of national consciousness. We're fighting, why can't we fight for our own nation? Why can't we fight for our own freedom? And so each sort of country does this different in terms of commemorating the Askaris' effect of this war. So these three monuments are actually in in British East Africa or modern-day Kenya. This one is in Tanzania, but basically the land that's been taken as a result of the war. So this one is in Dar es Salaam. This one is in Nairobi. As you can see, there's a porter. This one is in Mombasa. There's a porter here as well. And so in the 20s, this becomes an action of big pride. Look at how well the African troops did in the East African conflict. Look at how well they're serving the empire. But ultimately, all these ideas of nationalism, ideas of freedom, ideas of service, all these things are sort of floating around and coming together, but they don't really heavily coalesce until after this happens again in the Second World War. The Germans take a very different bent on this. As you can see, you don't have the Askari here being lauded for their efforts. You have the white officer being guided by the Askari, being guarded by the soldier on this side. So a very sort of different bent to this. Askaris are service. They're not someone that's sort of leading the way in this war. And so here's 1946. This is the King's African Rifles, the Kenyan African Rifles, marching through Nairobi. So they're still together, they're still defending the British Empire, and they continue to do this all the way in through the 1960s. The Mau Mau Rebellion in the 1950s in Kenya. The people who stamp it down are the King's and Kenyan African Rifles. So very much you have this system of generations who have been fighting both as colonial police and colonial soldiers out to defend the rights of the British or the rights of the French to maintain their colonial power over these regions. And the Kenyan African Rifles still exist today. They were one of the people that came in the mall shooting in Kenya and took out the gunman in there. So the ultimate question of this, what ultimately happens? All these people die, all these people have been fighting. What is the ultimate result? Well, here is the map after the war. So let me zoom in. And as you can see, it's completely different from the map before the war. It's basically the same, right? These have been turned into United Nations mandates that are ruled, Togoland and Cameroon are ruled jointly by the British and the French. Tanzania is a protectorate of Britain, and Southwest Africa gets controlled by Britain through South Africa. So basically all the divisions stay the same, except you just get a transfer of power to another colonial power after the war. And so this is the case all the way to decolonization in most cases. So Togoland gets lumped in with Ghana, which becomes decolonized in 1956. Togo itself, the other one, joins up with, joins up with Cameroon to get its independence in 1960. Namibia becomes Namibia in 1990, which is Southwest Africa. And Kenya, as I said, doesn't get its independence until 1963. So all these ideas come about, all these people die, all these people make an effort to show service, to awaken their sense of consciousness, but ultimately the effect is just a reinforcement of colonial power all the way until after the Second World War. Good. So thank you, that's all I have.